come quick. The text from my son flashed on my phone screen at 7:30 on a Tuesday evening. My heart jumped into my throat. I grabbed my keys and drove across town faster than I should have, my mind racing through worst-case scenarios. Was he hurt? Was there an emergency? I pulled up to his apartment building and took the stairs two at a time. When I reached his door, I could hear voices inside. Laughter. Music playing softly. I knocked, and the door swung open. My son stood there, wine glass in hand, face flushing red the moment he saw me. Behind him, a dinner party was in full swing. 6 people sat around his table, plates of pasta and salad spread across the surface. A birthday cake sat in the center with candles flickering. He froze, his mouth open then closed. Then he forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Yeah, that's the neighbor, he said loudly, gesturing toward me like I was a stranger. He just dropped something off. Everyone turned to stare at me. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. I realized then what was happening. They were celebrating someone's birthday. A coworker maybe. A friend. It was also my birthday. My 60th. And my son had no idea. Please don't make a scene, my son whispered, stepping into the hallway and pulling the door halfway closed behind him. I stood there holding a small birthday card I had written for myself. Pathetic, I know. But after 10 years of forgotten birthdays, I had started writing them just to remember what it felt like to be acknowledged. I had planned to show it to him, to gently remind him, to maybe laugh about it together. But now, standing in his hallway while his friends ate cake inside, I couldn't find words. I'm sorry, Dad, he said quickly, glancing back at the door. I didn't realize you were coming over tonight. I've got guests, and it's kind of a bad time. A bad time? On my birthday. The one he forgot. Again. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you're listening from. I said automatically, like I was narrating my own humiliation. My name is Adrian Hale. I'm 60 years old, and this was the night I realized my son had erased me from his life. The drive home felt longer than it should have. I kept the card on the passenger seat, unopened, mocking me with every red light. This wasn't the first time. It was the 10th. 10 consecutive years of forgotten birthdays. 10 years of excuses I made for him in my head. 10 years of telling myself he was busy, that life gets complicated, that it didn't matter. But it did matter. It mattered so much I could barely breathe thinking about it. After his mother left when he was 12, I raised him alone. I gave up promotions that required travel. I worked double shifts at the metal shop to pay for his college. I showed up to every parent-teacher conference, every baseball game, every graduation. I remembered every detail of his childhood, the way he laughed at cartoons, the time he broke his arm falling off his bike, the night he cried because kids made fun of his used sneakers. I had been his entire world, and now I was the neighbor he didn't want his friends to meet. The first year he forgot my birthday, I told myself it was understandable. He was 23, fresh out of college, starting his first real job. Life was overwhelming for him. I had bought takeout that night and eaten alone in front of the television. When coworkers asked how I celebrated, I lied and said it was wonderful. But I noticed something shift that year. He stopped inviting me to things. Company events, dinners with his friends. Holidays became rushed phone calls instead of visits. One afternoon, I showed up at his office to surprise him with lunch. I saw him through the glass window, laughing with colleagues. When he spotted me, his face changed. Not happy, nervous. Later, as we ate sandwiches in my truck because he didn't want to go back inside, I overheard him on the phone with someone. Yeah, that was my dad. No, don't worry about it. He's just, works with metal. Loud, dirty stuff. Nothing fancy. The shame in his voice hit me harder than any insult. The second year he forgot, I tried harder. I showed up at his apartment with cupcakes I had bought from the bakery near my house. Little chocolate ones with blue frosting, because blue used to be his favorite color. Nobody answered the door. I called him. Voicemail. I texted. No response. 3 hours later, he finally replied. Sorry, on a spontaneous weekend trip with friends. Didn't think to mention it. I left the cupcakes on his doorstep and drove home. By the time he texted me a photo 2 days later, they were covered in ants. He wrote, "Thanks for these, but they went bad. Maybe next time give me a heads up." I stared at that message for a long time. Then I deleted it and never mentioned the cupcakes again. That was the year I started realizing my son was embarrassed by me. Not angry, not resentful, just quietly, deeply embarrassed. At his college graduation party, he introduced me to a girl he liked. Her name was Vanessa. She had perfect hair and an expensive-looking dress. "This is Adrian," he said, "not my dad. Just my first name, like I was a family friend or a distant uncle. Adrian helped raise me," he added, smiling at her. "Helped raise me, like I was a babysitter, like his mother hadn't walked out and left me to do it all alone." Vanessa gave me a polite smile and turned back to my son, clearly uninterested. Later, I overheard her whisper to him, "Is he, like, your stepdad or something?" "Something like that," my son replied. I left the party early, claiming I had work in the morning. My son barely noticed. He was too busy trying to impress people who would forget him in a year. But I remembered everything, every slight, every dismissal, every moment he chose his image over his father. The third year he forgot my birthday. I received a text at 6 in the evening, a generic group message sent to at least 20 people. "Hope everyone has a great day." That was it. No name, no personalization, just a mass text that happened to arrive on my birthday. I sat at my kitchen table with a single cupcake and a candle I had lit for myself. I read that text 5 times, searching for meaning that wasn't there. He didn't even know. He had sent a cheerful message to dozens of people and had no idea one of them was his father on his 60th birthday. I blew out the candle alone. The smoke curled up toward the ceiling, and I watched it disappear. That was the year I started pulling back. I stopped calling as much, stopped offering to help with things, stopped trying to insert myself into his life. I hoped he would notice the distance, that he would ask if something was wrong. He didn't notice. In fact, he seemed relieved. By the 4th year, I had learned to expect nothing. But hope is a stubborn thing, and I still found myself checking my phone all day, waiting for a message that never came. My son had a new girlfriend by then. Her name was Vanessa, the same girl from the graduation party. She had moved in with him, and I rarely saw either of them. One evening, I stopped by their apartment to drop off a toolbox he had asked to borrow months earlier. Vanessa answered the door. "Oh, hi," she said, not inviting me in. "He's not here right now." "That's fine," I replied. "I just wanted to return this." She took the toolbox and glanced back into the apartment. "Your son talks about you sometimes," she said, her tone carefully neutral. "Does he?" I asked, surprised. She hesitated. "He says you're sweet, but he also says you're simple. You know, like you don't really get the way his world works now." Simple. The word hung in the air between us like a slap. "Right," I said quietly. "Well, tell him I stopped by." I left before she could say anything else. The 5th, 6th, and 7th birthdays blurred together into a single ache. Different apartments, different excuses, the same indifference. One year he was out of town. Another year he was sick. Another year he just forgot to check his calendar. I stopped lighting candles. I stopped buying cupcakes. I stopped pretending it didn't hurt. I became invisible, not just to my son, but to myself. I moved through my days like a ghost, working at the metal shop, coming home to an empty house, and wondering when I had stopped mattering. My coworkers noticed. "You okay, Adrian?" they'd ask. "Fine," I'd say. "Just tired." But I wasn't fine. I was disappearing piece by piece, and nobody seemed to care. The worst part wasn't the forgetting. It was realizing that my son didn't keep track of my birthdays anymore because he didn't think they mattered. I didn't matter. In the 8th year, I overheard something I wasn't supposed to hear. My son was on the phone with a friend, and I had stopped by his apartment unannounced. He didn't know I was standing outside his door. "I don't even keep track of his birthdays anymore," he said, laughing. "He's fine. He doesn't care about that stuff." I stood frozen in the hallway, my hand raised to knock. The words hit me like a punch to the stomach. He doesn't care. He thought I didn't care. Or, worse, he didn't care enough to find out. I lowered my hand. I turned around. I walked back to my truck and sat there for 20 minutes, staring at nothing. Something inside me snapped that day. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet, final break. I drove home, placed the birthday card I had written for myself on the dining table, and whispered, 10 years. And I made a decision. I was done. I stopped calling, stopped texting, stopped showing up unannounced. I let the silence settle between us like snow covering a grave. At first, I thought he would notice, that he would reach out and ask why I had gone quiet. But weeks passed, then months, and my phone stayed silent. He didn't notice because he had never been paying attention in the first place. The anger I expected never came. Instead, I felt something stranger. Relief. For the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for acknowledgement that would never come. I wasn't hoping for a relationship that didn't exist. I was free, but freedom felt a lot like loneliness. I sat in my house surrounded by tools and half-finished projects, and I realized I had spent so long being a father that I had forgotten how to be Adrian. So I started looking for him again, the man I used to be before my son's shame buried me alive. I found my late wife's old art studio in the back of the garage. It had been locked for years, untouched since she left. Dust covered everything. Canvases stacked against the walls. Paint dried in jars. Brushes stiff and forgotten. I stood in the doorway. Memories flooding back. She used to paint here every weekend. She said art was the only thing that made sense when life didn't. I understand that now. I started cleaning, sweeping, organizing, and then I noticed something in the corner, a pile of scrap metal I had been meaning to throw away for years. I picked up a piece, turned it over in my hands, and felt something stir inside me. Not sadness, not anger, something creative. I brought the metal to my workbench and started shaping it. I didn't have a plan. I just let my hands move, bending and welding and cutting until something took form. When I stepped back, I saw it. A candle melted and twisted, gripped tightly in a closed fist. I called it year one. I kept working. Every night after my shift at the shop, I came home and created sculptures made from scrap metal, each one representing a forgotten birthday. Year 2 was a table set for one. Year 3 was a phone with no messages. Year 4 was a door cracked open but never fully welcoming. Each piece released something inside me. Anger, grief, loneliness. I poured it all into the metal, and the metal held it without judgment. I wasn't creating art for my son. I was creating it for myself, to prove I still existed, to prove I still mattered. One Saturday afternoon, a man wandered into my garage. He was older, well-dressed, with sharp eyes that studied everything. "I'm Vincent," he said, extending his hand. "I owned the gallery downtown. I saw your light on and got curious." He walked around my workspace, examining each sculpture in silence. Then he turned to me. "These are extraordinary," he said. "Have you ever considered exhibiting?" I laughed. "I'm not an artist. I'm a metalworker." "You're both," he replied, "and I want to offer you a show." Vincent's offer terrified me. An entire exhibit of my work, on display for strangers to judge. But something in me needed to say yes. I needed to prove that I was more than a forgotten father. We titled the exhibit 10 Years Without a Candle. I spent months preparing, creating the final pieces, writing descriptions for each one, rehearsing what I would say if anyone asked about the meaning. Meanwhile, my son's life was falling apart. I didn't know the details at first, but I heard through mutual acquaintances. Vanessa had left him, calling him selfish and emotionally unavailable. His job was unstable. Bills were piling up. He started calling me again, leaving voicemails. "Hey, Dad, just checking in. Haven't heard from you in a while. Is everything okay?" I didn't call back, not out of cruelty, but because I had nothing left to say. I'd spent 10 years trying to be seen by him, and now I needed to see myself. The exhibit opening was 3 weeks away. I sent my son a formal invitation. No message, no explanation, just the time, place, and title. The gallery was packed on opening night. Strangers moved through the space, studying my sculptures, reading the placards, murmuring to each other. I stood in the corner, nervous and exposed. Vincent introduced me to journalists, collectors, and other artists. People shook my hand and told me my work was powerful, moving, honest. I felt seen for the first time in years. Not as someone's father, not as someone's embarrassment, just as Adrian. Then I saw him, my son, standing in the doorway, staring at the first sculpture. He walked slowly through the exhibit, reading each placard. Year 1, the first silence. Year 5, the cupcakes left to rot. Year 9, the group text. His face changed with each piece. Confusion became recognition. Recognition became horror. Horror became grief. When he reached the final sculpture, year 10, the neighbor, he stopped. His hands covered his mouth. His shoulders shook. He had finally understood. Every forgotten birthday, every dismissal, every moment of shame he had made me feel. He saw it all, reflected back in metal and pain. My son stood in front of year 10 for a long time. People walked around him, but he didn't move. He just stared at the sculpture of a man standing outside a closed door, face turned away, invisible. Then he turned and saw me across the room. Our eyes met, and something broke in his expression. He walked toward me, tears streaming down his face. "Dad," he whispered. "I didn't know. I didn't realize." "I know," I said quietly. "I was ashamed," he continued, his voice cracking. "Ashamed of where I came from. Ashamed that you worked with your hands. Ashamed that you didn't fit into the life I was trying to build. I thought if I kept you at a distance, people wouldn't see me as less." The crowd had gone silent. People were watching, but I didn't care. "I never needed you to be more than you were," I said. "I just needed you to look at me, to see me, to remember me." He collapsed into sobs. "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." I didn't hug him. Not yet. The wound was too fresh. But I didn't walk away either. After the exhibit closed, Vincent approached me with a contract. He wanted to represent me long-term. Buyers were interested. Magazines wanted interviews. My life was opening in ways I had never imagined. Not because I had punished my son, but because I had finally stopped waiting for his approval. I found my son sitting on a bench outside the gallery, his head in his hands. I sat down next to him. "Can we start over?" he asked, his voice small. "Yes," I said, "but differently." I handed him a small wooden box. He opened it slowly. Inside were 10 sealed envelopes. "What are these?" he asked. "Birthday messages," I said. "The things I wished you had said to me every year. You forgot." He stared at them, his hands trembling. "I don't deserve this." "No," I agreed. "But you're my son, and I'm giving you the chance I never got, to understand what you missed." He opened the first envelope. Inside, in my handwriting, were the words, "Happy birthday, Dad. I'm proud of you." He read it, then broke down completely. Over the following weeks, my son read each envelope. He called me after every one, his voice thick with guilt and grief. He told me he was going to therapy, that he was working on himself, that he wanted to rebuild what he had destroyed. I listened. I didn't forgive him immediately, but I listened. We started meeting for coffee once a week. Awkward at first, then slowly easier. He asked about my childhood, my marriage, the years he had been too self-absorbed to care about. He asked about my work at the metal shop. For the first time, he seemed genuinely interested instead of quietly ashamed. "Why didn't you ever tell me how much I hurt you?" he asked one afternoon. "Because I kept hoping you'd notice on your own," I said. "And by the time I realized you wouldn't, I was too tired to fight for your attention anymore." He looked down at his coffee. "I wasted 10 years. "Yes," I agreed. "You did. Can I make it up to you?" I thought about that. You can't give me back those years, but you can be present for the ones we have left. The exhibit toured to 3 other cities. My work was featured in a national art magazine. I was invited to speak at universities about finding purpose after loss. My son came to every event. He stood in the back, watching me speak, and afterward, he would tell me he was proud of me. Those words meant more than he would ever understand. On my 61st birthday, he showed up at my house at 7 in the morning with a homemade cake. It was lopsided and the frosting was uneven, but it was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. "Happy birthday, Dad," he said, his voice steady. We sat together at my kitchen table, the same table where I had spent so many birthdays alone. We ate cake and talked about nothing important, and it felt like the first honest conversation we had ever had. He didn't forget, and that meant everything. One afternoon, my son brought Vanessa to meet me. She was different now, softer. She shook my hand and said, "I'm sorry for what I said before, about you being simple. That was cruel and ignorant." "Thank you," I said. She looked at my son. "He talks about you all the time now, about how strong you are, how talented, how much he wishes he had seen it sooner." My son nodded. "I was wrong, Dad, about everything." "I know," I said, "but you're here now. That's what matters." We spent the afternoon together, the 3 of us. They asked about my next sculpture project. They asked about my childhood. They asked questions I had waited years to hear. And I answered them, not with bitterness, but with honesty. Because forgiveness isn't about forgetting. It's about choosing to move forward despite the past. A year after the exhibit, my son got married. Not to Vanessa, but to a woman named Helena who worked as a teacher and loved art. He asked me to walk him down the aisle. I know it's not traditional, he said, but you're the one who raised me. You're the one who should be there. I stood beside him as he married Helena, and I felt a pride I hadn't felt in years. Not because he had finally acknowledged me, but because he had become a man capable of acknowledging his mistakes. At the reception, he gave a speech. He talked about his mother leaving, about me raising him alone, about the years he wasted being ashamed. My father is the strongest man I know, he said, his voice breaking. And I'm sorry it took me so long to see that. The room applauded, but I didn't need the applause. I just needed my son to mean those words. And I believed he did. On my 62nd birthday, my son threw me a party. He invited my coworkers from the metal shop, friends from the gallery, people I had met through my art. The room was full of people who saw me, who knew my name, who celebrated me not because they had to, but because they wanted to. My son stood in the center of the room and raised his glass. To my father, he said, the man who never gave up on me, even when I gave up on him. I looked around the room at the faces smiling back at me, and I realized something. I had spent so many years being invisible, waiting to be seen by one person, that I had missed all the other people who had been seeing me all along. My coworkers, my neighbors, the gallery owner who believed in my work, the strangers who connected with my sculptures. I had never been invisible. I had just been looking in the wrong direction. A few months later, I received a letter from a stranger, a woman named Helena, not my son's wife, a different Helena, who had seen my exhibit in another city. She wrote, I saw your sculptures and I cried. My own son hasn't spoken to me in 3 years. Your work made me feel less alone. Thank you for creating something so honest. I read that letter 5 times. Then I wrote back. We became pen pals, 2 parents navigating the complicated pain of being forgotten by the children we loved. Through her, I realized my story wasn't just mine. It was shared by thousands of parents who had been dismissed, overlooked, and erased. My work wasn't just about my pain anymore. It was about giving voice to all the people who had been made to feel invisible. And that felt like purpose, like redemption, like the thing I was always meant to do. On my 63rd birthday, my son gave me a journal. On the first page, he had written, a place for you to write the things I should have said. I opened it and saw he had already filled the first 10 pages. 1 entry for each forgotten birthday. Happy birthday, Dad. I see you. Happy birthday, Dad. I'm proud of you. Happy birthday, Dad. You are enough. I read each one through tears. Not tears of sadness, but of release, of a wound finally beginning to heal. Thank you, I whispered. I'll write it every year, he promised, so you never feel forgotten again. And he has. Every single year since, he writes me a birthday message. Sometimes short, sometimes long, but always present, always seen. That journal sits on my bedside table now, filled with words I waited a decade to hear. It's the most valuable thing I own, not because it's expensive, but because it's proof that people can change, that sons can grow up, that forgiveness is possible. My son and I aren't perfect. We still have hard conversations. We still stumble over old wounds, but we show up for each other now, consistently, honestly. He comes to my studio and watches me work. He asks questions about my process. He brings Helena and their daughter, my granddaughter, to visit on her 3rd birthday. He threw her a party and invited me to help blow out the candles. You are the birthday expert in this family, he joked. I laughed, a real, genuine laugh that felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. Because the legacy I left my son wasn't punishment. It wasn't bitterness. It was 10 sculptures that forced him to see what he had missed, and 10 envelopes that showed him what he could become. He'll never forget me again, not because I demanded it, but because he finally understands the cost of forgetting. And that understanding, that painful, honest reckoning, is a something I left him that he'll carry forever. Not anger, not resentment, Just a truth, shaped in metal and love, waiting for him to finally see it. And when he did, everything changed.